This is the front wall of the mudroom. It has a door, a transom window above the door, and a window midway up to the right. I'm going to remove all of that and replace it with one larger window right in the center. There's also a box with 2 light switches, one for the ceiling light and the other for an outside light. This will get modified with the other electrical elements. Now, one thing I discovered about this room is that it used to be a breezeway. That means it was covered, but the front and back walls were non-existent and added at a later time. Where the drywall exists near the top of the wall is actually covering the original beam that spans more than the width of the room. In this situation, it's a huge advantage because the wall I'm about to destroy is not structural, it's purely cosmetic. I started by removing the switches and pulling away the wires. Of course, I did this after making sure the circuits were cold. At the time I started working on this part of the room, I wasn't entirely sure about the structural layout of the room, so I threw up a little support just for safety. In the long run though, this was not necessary in this situation. Let's get to the removal bits. First to go is the transom window and any framing related to it. Next is the regular window. And following that is the door. The doorway also had this roll-away sliding screen door that never worked. Would have been nice, but we never used it. I've always had a general plan of the changes to be made, but now with the things removed, it's time to get down to brass tacks and lock in those changes. This will determine where I need to cut the existing framing to splice in the new window with new framing. The goal is to get the new window centered in the room. I was super careful during this process to make sure not to overcut. So I removed a few things, added a few things, remeasured, and repeated until I had the framing I needed. At the time, lumber prices were still kind of insane, so I used as much leftover pieces as possible while still following proper protocol. That means proper spacing, a treated board on the ground, proper window framing with a cripple stud, jack stud, king stud, and a header, all in the while knowing that this is still a cosmetic wall. After the window framing was done, I test fit the window in place. It looked good, but before attaching it, I added some weather flashing at the base and some caulking around the entire edge. The window has a flange for attachment. Once it's level, it's easy to attach with screws going through the holes around the edge. The day was quickly coming to an end, so I boarded up the opening for the night, mostly to prevent any trash pandas from inviting themselves in. In the morning, I got right back to work. First up was to attempt to anchor down the new section of wall to the concrete, though I quickly learned that since this used to be a sidewalk and not a foundation, the concrete is not so thick. I punched right through to the dirt. I also did this to the back wall next to the door. Same issue with the thin concrete. I used this anchor bolt epoxy to fill in the holes and hopefully secure the bolts to whatever concrete was there. I tried to rotate the bolts quite a bit to get the epoxy mixed into the threads, but held off tightening the bolts until the epoxy was cured. I continued with framing and weatherproofing the front. The window got trim boards around the edge. I should have doubled up the thickness to make them pop out further than the siding, but we'll say that's a job for tomorrow. I put some metal flashing above the top window trim, and now it's time to fill in the gaps of the siding, but I ran into a problem that ended up being a bit difficult to solve. Alright, so here's the thing about this old siding, is that it's like a 2x10, so from here to here is like 9.5 inches or so, which makes this And then the thickness down here is about 1.5 inches, which makes this kind of like a 2x10, except it tapers. So from here it's the full thickness, but then up here it's about half the thickness, maybe even a little less than that. So you can like have a 2x10, but you have to like cut it diagonally somehow. And unless you have like a sawmill or some way to do that, it's just not possible. So what I'm gonna do is use a 1x, which is gonna be kind of this like front half, and then I'll use a spacer that will take up this back area, which will kick it out a little bit, enough to match the thickness of this. So that's my solution. So let's get going. I started with the kicker piece at the bottom and then got to work making elongated L's. The top of the L is still too thick to match up with the neighboring siding. I just needed to rip off a bit of the top inside face. This ended up being my excuse to go out and buy an electric planer. Not what I anticipated having to do, but sometimes you gotta go with the flow. This is the first time I've used a tool like this, and I gotta say it works great. I did mess up the blades a bit by running them through a finish nail, but holy cow, if you need to make some wood shavings, this is the way to go. It just rips through the wood and makes it super easy to get the taper I needed. The edging here used to be a part of the doorway, so I did my best to make a piece that matched what was up above to fill that in. Some of the new siding wasn't laying pressed up against the pieces below it. Kind of a bummer, but understandable as this is not normal siding. So I used smaller nails to, let's say, encourage the new siding to lay flat. Next was to prep for paint, which means a generous amount of caulking, followed by power washing. Now, the thing about this house is it's yellow. Yellow fades over time and very unevenly at that. So in my attempt to color match, I tried to figure out the closest to one of probably 8 different shades of yellow, and it looks terrible. No worries though, because we're looking to have the entire house painted not yellow. So this really just has to tide us over until that happens. Now that the outside is done, I can more leisurely work on finishing the inside. Unlike before, this entire wall will have insulation. I'd like to run an HVAC line into this room at some point, so upping its R value is important. In any of the gaps too small for insulation, I filled with spray foam. Next up is drywall. I started at the top and worked my way down. The electrical gets a little interesting in here. The switches that used to be on this wall are gone and moving to the back wall of the room. However, I still needed to run a wire from the top left to the bottom right to power the exterior light. The old cables aren't long enough to reach, so I decided to add an additional cable to connect the existing two. Whenever there's an electrical connection, there needs to be access to it through a junction box. So in this case, one box goes up on the top left and the other goes on the bottom right. The one on the top left will be out of view once I build some fancy lockers in that area, and the one on the bottom right will be mostly obscured by the washing machine. The rest of the drywall was pretty straightforward, except for this piece. This wall has stucco since it used to be an exterior wall way back in the day. In order to secure this, I had to use construction adhesive and wait. Eventually, it held well enough that I could use a boatload of tape to hold it for the rest of the curing duration. This is a zip bit, and it goes in a Dremel or router to only cut drywall for clean looking openings. Eventually, the drywall piece had cured enough to allow cutting out and replacing another section of drywall. And with that, we have a newly constructed wall that looks great. The single window makes the room feel bigger and more inviting. There is still quite a bit more work to do in this room, but I am glad this step of the process is over. Okay, that's it for now. See ya.